I'm Ken Russell. I'm the web guy for the club. Been on the board for about 7 years. I'm here with my two boat partners to give you this presentation on our trip this summer to up the central coast of BC to over to Haida Gwaii and back down. Deb Bryant, my wife. Alan Crabtree, our boat partner. We've got a boat, which you see here, that it's actually moored in Vancouver, Falls Creek. And so we're going to tell you a little bit about our trip. I'll warn you that we made it. Well, anybody can do this trip. So it sounds like, it's tough, but it's not. So I'll just start out with that. And yeah, so here we go. This is one of our favorite anchorages here. And
drone.
Yeah, Alan has a drone. He was a photographer. He took most of the photos that you'll see, and also laid out the PowerPoint. So just to brag a little bit about our boat, we have a very old school boat. That's really not the best boat to do this trip in. There were only a dozen of them made in North Vancouver. 1978 boat that was really designed to go around the world. In fact, a sister ship of this boat went around the world. Captained by a woman, so it's actually called a True North 34. It's 34 feet on deck, 40 feet overall with bowsprit, full keel, stern hung rudder, tiller, diesel stove. So pretty old school, really old school. Has half the reason we bought it was because it has a brand new 38 beta engine. And carries 125 gallons of diesel and 100 gallons of water. Way overkill for what we did, right? So we left on June 30th to June 3rd, and came back August 17th. We're out 76 days with 15 layover days. We traveled 1,579 miles, nautical miles by the GPS, and ran 317 engine hours and burned 258 liters of diesel. We motored most of the way, not because we didn't want to sail, but because it was calm most of the way. Or there was 1 or 2 knots of wind, and we needed to make time. So we did do a fair amount of motor sailing in certain areas where there was enough wind to stabilize us and push us along a little bit, but we needed to keep moving because we had a lot of miles to cover. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how to prepare for a trip like this. It sounds like you need a really heavy boat to do it, but it's not true. When Mike Reed and I were going around the north end of Vancouver Island, this must have been like 6 or 7 years ago, I met a woman who was taking a Catalina 27 with an outboard gas engine up to Alaska and up the Inside Passage. And you can do that. You don't need a big heavy boat to go up the Central Coast, but you need to understand your boat. It needs to be in good condition. You need to plan ahead. You need to watch the weather. Any boat could do this trip, given those 4 factors. So it doesn't require, like a super boat. You do need to, and I'll mention it in a minute, estimate what your burn rate is for fuel and how much you carry, and plan your refueling or repositioning stops, because it is quite remote up in the Central Coast. As far as the engine goes, you want your engine to be in good condition. You want a toolkit. You want it to be all maintained and ready to go, and have all your spares. Because you will rely on your engine on this trip, unless you have infinite time and you don't mind, going slowly if the winds aren't strong. Need to have good ground tackle. As many of you may know, the anchorages up there are very deep. So we actually, upgraded all our ground tackle before we went up there. We carried 150 feet of chain and 200 feet of nylon, 8-plate nylon on the end of that. So we had quite a bit. Saying that, we usually found anchorages in 50 feet or less. Sometimes it was around 50 feet. The weather was relatively calm, so I was able to put out 5-to-1 scope, and we were good. There was a couple of places where we had some weather come in. Actually, 2 areas where there was a gale coming in, according to weather forecast. We're in a well-protected anchorage. We made sure it was a little less steep, so we're in like 30 feet. And so I was put out about 7-to-1, and I could have put out more if I wanted to, but because they were so well protected, we're fine. So you do need a good ground tackle.
Yeah.
Tides. Oh yeah, I'll talk about that a little bit later. Yeah, I mean that's good. There is tides there are higher than here, so 10 to 15 feet. So you do have to take that into consideration when you're anchoring. That if you're going in and you're anchoring at low tide, you know, you have to figure you're going to come up 15 feet or so. It wasn't as bad as I had kind of heard about, but you have to figure 10 to 15 feet of tidal variation. Navigation. So our boat had radar when we bought it, which was good. We only used it a couple of times. We had a lot of electronic chart redundancy. We had our Lawrence system, which was on the boat when we bought it. We had 3 computers all running OpenCPN. We had a laptop, or no, iPad running avionics, and all our three iPhones all running avionics. So. And we weren't going to buy paper charts, but we could not find any. You won't find. We left Vancouver. There weren't any paper charts in this area there. We thought, oh, Port McNeill, they'll have it. We went to Port McNeill. They didn't have any paper charts. We went all the way up to Prince Rupert. They had no paper charts. But we figured we were good with the electronic charts that we had. You can have U.S. charts are free. Canadian charts cost money. We could have printed dozens of Canadian charts, but it would have cost a lot of money, and we would have had to have done it ahead of time. We felt pretty secure with our electronic redundancy and with GPS and AIS and radar that we didn't worry about that too much. Yeah.
In the old days, Canada used to require paper charts for the
commercial boats. I don't think anybody require. I don't know if they require them still for recreation.
They don't.
I don't think so. Yeah, commercial. I mean, it's surprising. I mean, it's paper charts are. And I looked for chart packs. I asked everybody about chart packs, and I'd go to the main place in town and say, we want to buy charts, and they say we don't have them. And I'd say, do you have a chart pack? Just a not official chart pack. No, we don't have it. So, but
Any placement?
yeah, placemat. I actually recently. Yeah. Exactly. And this is these are published by actually the same people who publish Wagner's, which I'll talk about in just a minute. And it's good for planning. They're not charts; they're maps. But this was useful for planning. So I won't go into too much detail there. We had an inReach, which allowed us to post online. I don't know how many people know about inReaches, but your friends and loved ones can follow your track, right, using an inReach. So when you subscribe, you buy the hardware, you subscribe, and it creates a map, a track, your track, so people can watch your track. And also it has a emergency capability. So if we were ever to get in trouble, we could like hit the emergency button and we would be in contact via satellite with the inReach people who would relay that information to the Coast Guard or whoever. So we had that as a kind of a backup. So one thing going up there is that resupply places are few and far between. So you do need to estimate your distances, your burn time for fuel, and how much water you drink. So we have these kind of massive tanks that are meant for going across the Pacific. If you have a smaller boat with, you know, smaller fuel, water, and propane tanks, then you just have to know what your rate of usage is so that you can resupply at certain points. Generally, you want to be able to be out there at least a week to 10 days between resupply points. And so you want to have fuel, propane, and water that will last you at least 10 days. So we did see boats out there with, you know, fuel tanks on deck, a couple of extra spare fuel tanks because their fuel tank might not have gone that far. You can resupply at several places, which we'll talk about later. You want to check your rigging if you're a sailboat. Before you go, make sure you feel very secure about that your rigging is safe and up to date. That's a whole topic that I won't get into. You want, just to go back, you want to have a good boom preventer because you know, that's the #1 reason that people lose their either boom or mast or rigging. So understanding how to have a good boom preventer is important, and have that all set up. But then we never got into a situation where there was really serious storm when we were sailing, and we would have just ducked. Well, twice we had gales twice. They were predicting gales. We just pulled into a secure area and dropped the anchor, put out a lot of scope, and just waited till the storm went by, or the gale went by. So, okay. Safety equipment, of course, if you're out there, you want to make sure you have adequate clothing. We left and it was a cold spring, and it rained for the first 3 weeks. We got to Port McNeill. I was cold. I didn't have enough clothing. When we had left Vancouver, it was sunny and kind of warm. I bought extra clothing in Port McNeill. So make sure you have enough clothing. You want to have harness and tethers. You want to have jack lines set up in the morning, not when you need it, but before you need it. We had, of course, a life sling, a horseshoe, and a horseshoe buoy, and other safety equipment. So you would just want to make sure you're on top of all of that. We had plenty of cruising guides. Here's our cruising guides. We consulted all of them. They varied in how good they were. The North Coast of British Columbia was very useful. The others less so, but we would, every day when we were looking for a place to anchor, we kind of browse through our cruising guides and see what it said about that area and where we could anchor. But Wagoners, this is gonna sound like I'm a salesperson for Wagoners. Wagoners was our go-to cruising guide. It's really good. It only has a small fraction of the anchorages in the Central Coast because it's pretty new. They haven't done the Central Coast very much. And we at the Seattle Boat Show, we were actually talking to the editor, and we said how useful it was. And she said they're developing the Central Coast section of their cruising guide. But I'll actually really plug their There, introductory kind of pages. There's about 15 pages to tell you everything you could possibly think about in going north, including going through what we'll talk about: gateways, narrows, safety equipment, provisioning, all that stuff. So I have to say I was really impressed by Wagner's, and I remember looking at it maybe 15 or 20 years ago and going, another cruising guide. But they've really upped their game. They were bought out by a new publisher, and they've really been improving it. So that is kind of what I would recommend your first place to look. When we're going up there, I think this is about my last slide, almost my last slide. When we're going up there, one of the things that I do, I learned this trick from a professional sail trainer. I made a spreadsheet of specific to my boat that lists all of the systems. So I've got, we were doing tides separately than this, so that the tides aren't there. But I have my location, my destination, what the weather is, the start time, engine time, end time. So like keeping track of my time out. The water tank, the checking the bilge every day, the house battery, and we also kept separate track of that. Actually, check the oil level every day, the transmission fluid, the coolant, the strainer. So every day I would check this stuff, and then I'd keep notes on when I fueled. And this way, you're just right on top of your maintenance. So if something's kind of going off, you'll learn about it early. And also, you can get a good idea of how much fuel you're burning, how much water you're using, are you burning any oil, all that stuff. So every day, in the morning, I would check that stuff and write it down. And then we had some other logs. I mean, then there's a kind of a narrative log of where we went and all that sort of thing. So, you know, that's very useful for a long trip like that. Obviously, you don't need to do that for going out to Susha. Electrical and batteries, I won't talk much about this. We just made sure that everything's working. The only problem we had out there, we knew it when we left. Our batteries were a little old. Actually, the original batteries on the boat, lead acid batteries. We didn't know how old they were. We knew that they weren't, but they were working okay. And what we found was that we were running the engine almost every day, so they were always pretty much topped up. But if we were anchored for 3 days while we were waiting for some weather to go by, the batteries would get too low. So we're monitoring the voltage every day. In fact, Alan is our electrical guy, and he'd monitor that. And we found that by the 3rd day, we were too low. So we'd have to run the engine, even if we were at anchor, to try to top them up. So, you know, you want to be on top of your electrical system, just like everything else. It's useful to know your average daily load and know your battery capacity. So, you know, another boat system to be aware of. And we actually took along, this is kind of interesting, a jump battery. I don't know how many people know about that, but you can get these auxiliary batteries. They're usually used for cars, for automobiles. So if your battery goes dead, you could clip it into your battery and it'll start your engine. We took one and I tested that. It would start if I turned off the battery to the diesel. I'd clip that into the battery, to the wires, and I could start the diesel with that. And it would also supply, let's say our batteries ran out and we couldn't run our electronic navigation. It had a USB plug-in. We could plug in our electronics to that jump battery, and we'd have a backup battery. So kind of useful thing to take along, very cheap to buy and useful. So, and we're near the end here of my little spiel. And the other thing is just trip planning. We had friends who had done this trip before. They gave us advice on where to stop, good places to anchor. So just planning ahead and figuring out how many days it'll take. You have to factor in extra weather days. So you're going up there and, gales coming in or some bad weather. So when you're planning, how far you can go, given how fast you expect to go, you have to throw in some extra days in case you have to slow down somewhere or stop and let the weather go through. Where you can re-provision and all that. So just planning ahead. And that's it for me. I'm going to turn this long monologue over to my dear partner, Deb, and she's going to talk about Gateway on the way there.
So hi, and speaking of planning, one of the things that really kind of caught our attention as we were going north was this idea of gateways, or kind of tricky areas or passages that we had to do some extra thinking and planning for. And the idea of gateways was actually came out of that Wagoner's Guide that Ken mentioned. And they really describe these areas that are often kind of a barrier for folks. These are the three that I'm going to talk about. There was a couple of other ones, but the three that were between Vancouver and Haida Gwaii that we encountered. So in order to do that, you need some good reference material. You really need to be on top of the weather and the tides and really know what's ahead of you for the next day or two. And leave some wiggle room in your itinerary so that you're not kind of rushing through kind of a tricky area because you said you were going to meet somebody or you had some kind of a deadline. Because as Ken said, there was a couple of gales that we encountered, and both of them were on one side or the other of one of these gateways. Okay, next one. So the first set is through the Discovery Islands and Johnson Strait. And people who know the land between Vancouver Island and the mainland might recognize this absolute jigsaw puzzle of islands and water passages. So there are four main routes through the site, and Alan, with the magic of his technology, is going to show you those. Going north, we opted to go through Surge Narrows, the one that you've just seen. And returning south, we opted, and we'll talk about that later, but to come back through Seymour Narrows and Johnson Strait. But these are the four through this area. And, just looking at this map, you can tell why the currents and the tides and the kind of passage could be tricky, because this is a set of islands of really narrow passages packed in between the mainland and Vancouver Island. To the south is the open Georgia Strait. To the north is Queen Charlotte Strait. Here you've got all of these great big inlets that go way in, and so the tidal influence in this area is substantial. So areas that we had to pass through, and this would be one example right in here. When the tide was, when the tide was slack, you could get through no problem. When the tide was running, you would get standing waves and whirlpools and stuff like that. So this is, you always try to go through at slack tide. You always do go through at slack tide, but you really need to plan for that. What we did, I think you can, no, you can go back, sorry. What we did was refer to current and tide tables, and we were looking at them all the time. We referenced and used our electronic navigation. We had Navionics, as Ken said, on our kind of handheld device. We had the Lowrance on our onboard, and we were just constantly kind of trying to reference those resources so that we would know days ahead when we were planning to get to one of these particular locations and what we could expect and whether we needed to wait or move quickly or whatever. So the second gateway is Cape Caution. And I think a lot of people will know about Cape Caution. So here's the north end of Vancouver, the east or west end of Vancouver Island, rather. This is kind of coming through that gateway I just talked about. And here is Cape Caution. And Cape Caution is well known, infamous, I would say, as being a tough crossing to make. It's open to Pacific swells. There is, this is our route here. There is this huge network of inlets and fjords north of it, and the tides empty out into this area right here. So, the water just off Cape Caution can get really challenging, steep waves, disorganized seas, and so worth really planning for and trying to get there at the right time. When we left Port McNeill, we knew there was a gale coming in, and Candace talked about this. So we tried to figure out what our best plan of action was, and I think you can go to the next slide, Alan. After after some debate, we decided to head for this Miles Inlet, which is right in here, and it's just to the south of Cape Caution. We knew that we could get there, and it looked pretty protected. So we pulled into there. We holed up there for a couple of days. Here's us coming in on a beautiful, one of the few sunny afternoons we had. This is the entrance, and you can hardly even see it. You have to know where you're heading for because it's just a little slot. And then here's an overhead shot of the anchorage itself. This is either just before or just after the gale. I can't remember which one, but you can see it's just, as smooth as glass in there. We were the only boat, and we settled down for the gale and just had, felt really secure in there. We had lots of scope out, and the next day we headed out and rounded Cape Caution. We had an easy crossing around the Cape and then got into an anchorage in Wet Fife Sound, which is just north of Cape Caution, and settled in there. I think you can move north. So we're not quite there yet, but what we learned after we left Miles Inlet is that the next night there was 6 boats anchored in there. We were really glad that we weren't in that gale with 6 other boats in that tight little anchorage. We felt safe just by ourselves, but it would have been very tricky. So then the last one going north is Hecate Strait. And this is a truly notorious, many of you will probably know, a truly notorious piece of water between the mainland of Vancouver Island, or the mainland here, and Haida Gwaii. The reasons why it is so, there's the crossing we made. The reasons why it's so challenging is that it's open to the north. This is Dixon Entrance to the north, Queen Charlotte Sound, I think, to the south. There's opposing wind, wave, and currents coming from both directions, and it's pretty far north, and the wind, the weather can really pick up there. It's also very, very shallow. I think at the deepest is about 300 feet, and in this whole area in here, maybe between 30 and 50 feet. So it's very shallow. So the seas can really pick up and be completely disorganized and unpredictable. So we knew this, and we were kind of prepared for it. We spent several days in Prince Rupert, actually, for a couple of different reasons. But one of them was waiting for a good weather window to cross Hecate. And we had planned to cross with our travel buddies, which we'll talk about a little later, Pam and Tim Hawley on Telecom. And we spent a good amount of time looking at the different, looking at what was going on with the weather, looking at the crossing options, and so on and so forth. We consulted a couple of weather apps, Windy, which is a free kind of handheld app, if people know that, where it's got a free, you can access it freely. There's Predict Wind, which is a paid service. They're both good and really useful. You can look a few days ahead and see what the winds are going to do. We use Navionics for currents and so on and so forth. We also discovered that Environment Canada, has a sort of a phone your meteorologist service. So we could actually phone and talk to a meteorologist at Environment Canada and tell them where we were going and what we were planning to do. And they gave us advice on, and great advice on that crossing. Actually, we got a couple of times we used them. They were awesome. So that's a free service by the Government of Canada, unlike charts. We consulted the marine radio daily all the way up and down to really try to make sure that we were on top of weather. And what we wanted to do, and you can advance now, crossing Hecate Strait, we wanted to avoid this because we knew it was possible that we could get into a situation like this that would have been very hairy. And luckily, this is what we wanted, which meant no sailing, unfortunately, but just glass smooth conditions across. We had about 20 hours of daylight or of light at this point because it was right on solstice, so we knew we just would be able to. We had a good weather window and we turned out fabulous.
So this is a 12-hour cross.
On the return trip, however, we knew that there was a gale coming in. We were kind of hanging out in Skidegate Inlet and decided to make the crossing ahead of the gale. And it was not quite as fun coming back the other way. We did make it. I was not sure we were going to, but Ken was confident and Alan was comatose.
Bouncing up and down.
But we did make it, and we hit the Spicer Island and complex and holed up and waded through another gale there. And so anyways, now we're just on our final gateway I want to talk about, and this is coming back south. We've come down through past the coast. We're heading back into the Georgia Strait and going through Johnson Strait. We again did our careful planning. One thing I'll mention here is that we did find the current tables or the current references that we could get either from our navigation or from Navionics on our phone, or even the tables that we would reference from Environment Canada, from that's not it, but anyways, the Canadian government were not very reliable. So we always tried to leave quite a lot of wiggle room in those passages. If it said the current was going to be behind us and at 4 knots, and that would mean we might be going 10 knots, we didn't actually plan for that. And that was good because it really wasn't very predictable. But we did come down through Johnson Strait and had a very nice passage through Seymour Narrows, which is the kind of the, again, notorious pass in Johnson Strait. And we managed to encounter a massive school of porpoises that kind of traveled along with us. There must have been 1,000 animals in this school, and they were feeding on salmon, but then they joined the boat and just kind of gambled along with us. So this was our last gateway crossing, and it was a real treat. And then back to Falls Creek. And so those kind of pinch points or important planning points. And now Alan is just going to walk you through the kind of overall travelogue of our trip.
So that sort of started without me. So kind of quickly work our way up through from Vancouver up north. We started off early June, mostly in the rain, and tried to make long days because it was cold, it was wet, there was really no point in joining Anchorage. We worked our way up past Exeter Island and Powell River to Gorge Harbor. Always made sure we started with a nice hearty breakfast. Deb was our chef extraordinaire, and I was the dishwasher extraordinaire. So I was, I think I got the better part of that deal. There's always interesting commercial traffic, not a lot of small boat traffic this time of year, but barges and container ships and cruise ships. I mean, just whatever you think. It's almost like a sea highway. Next few days, we worked our way up around Johnson Strait, north of Vancouver Island, up to Port McNeill. Port Neville is an old post office. It's not in operation anymore. a nice dock you can stay at. Even managed to get the sail out just to prove that we didn't motor 100% of the time, but a lot of gray days, a lot of just watching the trees and rocks as we went by. Still a lot of snow in the mountains. Was definitely a lot of runoff. All the creeks were running high, but it was not summer yet, even though it was approaching the solstice. From Port McNeill, we headed up north around Cape Caution, up into what's really the inside passages. This is the way a lot of cruise ships go. The Alaska State Ferry goes this way up to Bella Bella Shearwater, which is the first major place you can reprovision. Bella Bella is a native town. Shearwater is a marina sort of attached to the town. They're both run by the tribe there, but it's a common stopping place. Again, more Disney cruise ship that we were in a very narrow passage, and there was at least about a 8-foot bow wake from that boat that was quite interesting as we rock and rolled over that. From Shearwater, we headed up north, staying mostly on the inside, Clemto and Indian Village, Butedale, up the Grenville Channel, which is a long, straight, channel up to Prince Rupert, which is about as far north as you can get on the BC coast. Ketchikan is maybe another 50 miles north of there. Clemto is a Indian village only serviced by the ferry. They had a beautiful new longhouse, big house, new carvings. It was just an amazing place to visit and to see the old cannery of Butedale, with actually docks still in decent condition. This is pretty close to the solstice in Prince Rupert, so it's probably 11 p.m. at night, and it's nice being that far north on the longest day of the year and really being able to enjoy these long days. So from Prince Rupert, we headed west to Haida Gwaii. This is Spicer Island, where we met in Prince Rupert with our friends Pam and Tim on Telecom, and we buddy boated over to Haida Gwaii from there. So this is probably the most crowded anchorage we were in anywhere north of Vancouver Island. So this was like almost like too much for us to bear, but we survived. Made the cross again over to Haida Gwaii. So I'll give you a little bit of history of Haida Gwaii. Maybe 10 or 15 years ago, Haida Gwaii was called Queen Charlotte Islands, of course named by the British. And when the Haida Nation sort of gained more control, they renamed the two island group Haida Gwaii, which means people of the Haida. There's two major islands. There's the Graham Island to the north and Moresby Island to the south. One of the major cities used to be called Queen Charlotte City. It's now Dajin Gives, which is again, traditional Haida names. The Haida people have lived on these islands for 14,000 years, ever since the ice disappeared. I mean, they have a long, long tradition, and the Haida people were fierce warriors. They came as far down as Whidbey Island, raided all the way down in Whidbey Island, and dugout canoes being paddled. Now there's probably about 4,500 people that live on the two islands. But at the time of first contact with the Europeans in the 1770s, there were 30,000 Haida. So by 1900, there were 300 left. Smallpox, other diseases, just 1% of people survived that 100-year period after opening up with traders. So it was definitely they were definitely changed by Western civilization. In the 1980s, there's beautiful old growth timber that was being just cut down by the thousands and thousands of acres. The Haida people finally sort of did a lot of direct action in the 80s, got the southern part of the southern island protected, became Gwaii National Park, which they run concurrently with the government. So Gwaii is the park, Haida Gwaii is the two islands together. And the Gwaii Park has the traditional old watchkeeper sites where there's old native villages with totem poles still there, with a lot of artifacts. And that's the big draw of going to Haida Gwaii, is to go down the coast, see these historic sites. They all have Haida people who act as tour guides, as interpreters, as protectors. And so you really get a sense of what life was like. Here's one of the watchkeepers singing a Haida song for us. So from Dashingid, just like I said, the main town, we worked our way down south, taking our time. We spent about 3 weeks exploring the southern part of this island, again with our friends on Telecom, going into small harbor, small bays, stopping at the different watchkeeper sites. These are our friends Pam and Tim. This is in actually this is in Sandspit, which is again in the center part of the two islands, one of the marinas there. A lot of times we would just tie up with them. They had a bigger boat, so they would drop the anchor and we would come in and tie up. And they also had a lot more room for wine than we did, so we didn't mind buddy boating with them whenever we could. This is a modern pole that celebrates the new kind of Guayhanas and the power of the Haida community. When you contrast it with some of the older sites, this is an older longhouse site with the cedar logs that are still part of the foundation for that site from, these could be 200 or 300, 400 years old. The poles, they are all rotting in place. They decided to not preserve them, so they're all in various states of falling down or leaning, but there are still quite a few poles that you can see, and you really get a sense of what life might have been like way back then, even before the Europeans invaded. One of the watchkeepers was on one site was telling us stories. She had just gotten this tribal tattoo, which is her clan, on her face because she wanted to preserve her Haida heritage. But all the watchkeepers were very informative, very, a lot of respect for their culture, for the land, and we just learned so much, and we felt really honored to be guests at their sites. A lot of beautiful anchorages, a lot of weather pretty much turned really nice for us after the solstice. So this clearly was one of the highlights of our trip. There's a hot spring island, which has a lot of native hot springs. So it's a big popular draw for people touring Guayhanas. Oops. I did that. This is what the poles used to look like. The villages used to look like probably 100, 150 years ago. Just everybody had poles. The Haida were tremendous carvers of poles, of story poles, of mortuary poles. In fact, a lot of archaeologists think that they originated it, and a lot of the other tribes around the Salish Sea and the North Coast copied their carving styles. This is Haida Gwaii, the most intact village, the very south part. It's also a World Heritage Site, the only one on the West Coast. And this has the most of the standing poles, and even after hundreds of years, you can still see a lot of details, still a lot of the faces and a lot of these stories carved into these four beautiful bays and with no one around. Amazing tidal pool life, amazing clean fresh water, urchins, sea stars, crabs, whales occasionally, a lot of jellies, just pristine waters, just beautiful places to explore. This is a 2,000-year-old Sitka spruce, really special tree. Oh, these things are going faster than I want. Ignore that trip. We're good. So a lot of paddling, and we took inflatable kayaks instead of a dinghy, and they were really good for getting out and exploring shallow areas. And so working our way back up north, we stopped at some of the same places and found some different anchorages. And over another week or so, headed back up to Dajingi. So our friends on telecom left at the south part of the island and headed back to Vancouver Island. So from there on, we were back on our own. We crossed back over Hecate Strait and over to the Spicer Islands, our jumping off spot, which is the shortest route to get to Haida Gwaii, and worked down our way down what is called the outside passage. So it's more of the area that's more open to the open ocean to the west. Again, just beautiful open areas, no other boats. A lot of the coastline you can see is just, the islands are rocks up to the high tide line, and that's where the trees start. Totally impenetrable, but we tried to collect as much bounty, crabs. Deb was our fishing person and caught 2 or 3 good size salmon, a lingcod, and something else even. What was the other fish? Was it just a lingcod and the salmon? Rockfish, yeah. Collected limpets and had those for dinner. Sea cucumbers, which we thought about eating and decided they were more trouble than they were worth, but
They're reputed to be good though, so one day.
we did have beautiful clear skies a lot of the time, made up for all the rain. Worked our way back down the central BC coast, again trying to stay outside as much as we can. Back to Bella Bella, to Shearwater. A lot of narrow passages where you're really having to pay attention to the tides and the depths, and maybe we have a 6-foot draft boat and we might have been at 8 feet water certain times. So just careful navigation, lots of inlets and bays to explore. I'll let you talk about this, Ken.
Yeah, so this one day we were quite on the outside, and Deb and I were paddling around in our kayak, and we saw this building kind of over in the trees, and so we paddled over there, and there was a float home. So Deb actually grew up on a float home, actually. There's this float home in the middle of nowhere, and this is like way on the outside. This is not like inside. So this woman motions us over, and we start up a conversation with her, and she says, well, would you like to come on the float and have a drink? And we say, oh, sure, So we tie up our kayaks and we go on the float. The float is in this little cove that's protected from the Pacific by just a few rocks and islands, right? Protected in the cove with lines that hold it there, tied to the land around it, to the rocks and land around it, and a couple of anchors, a sailboat that's tied up to next to it, and so we're chatting with them, and it's this absolutely darling building, 2 buildings actually on this float, a man and a woman in their late 50s, early 60s. And we say, well, so what's this all about? And they go, oh, well, we live here. And we go, well, yeah, so you live here in the summer? And no, we live here all year. They lived there for 17 years. And they had all wood fired stove. That's the way they heated their place, the way they cooked. They would take their sailboat, which they really didn't sail on. He said, oh, I tried sailing. I don't really like it, but it was in perfect condition. He said, we take our sailboat and we motor into a Prince Rupert. We resupply once or twice a year. We come back out. He said, oh, the fishermen stop by and give us fish. And they live out there winter and summer. They were talking about maybe retiring back to the mainland, but they had this absolutely beautiful float that was full of kind of folk art and
Whatever floated up on the
Yeah.
beach.
yeah, and everything, all this stuff is like stuff they collect off the beaches, right? I mean, and then they grow their own vegetables on the float, And I said, is that a hot tub? They go, yeah, that's our wood burning hot tub. They said, come on back tonight, we'll fire it up for you. So Deb and I kayaked over at night and took a hot tub in their wood fired hot tub on the float, right? And a lovely couple, but you meet the strangest things out there, yeah, that's it.
So the last part of our sort of secluded section of the trip, we left Bella and spent a lot of time, about a week in this area called the Goose Island, a lot of small coves, and most of the time we were out there all by ourselves. We would go for days and not see another boat. And it was just the most beautiful cruising grounds, just, maybe a day's north of Vancouver Island. I think we could spend all summer out there and never get bored, but it's just beautiful little inlets and rocks and things to explore. On one of the big islands is the Hecate Institute, which is a former fishing lodge, and they do a lot of scientific study of the waters around the Central Coast. They call it the coastal margin of British Columbia. And on this particular island, you can take trails over to the west side, to the open Pacific side, where there's some big sandy beaches. So that was a treat to actually get to cross an island and not have to fight our way through old growth timber. But again, just it's almost, without hyperbole, just one of the most beautiful places I've been. So we finally decided we had to head back home. So we worked our way back down to Port Neal around Vancouver Island through Seymour Narrows and back to Vancouver. So it was almost 3 full months. I think we said 75 days. And a lot of it, despite the fact that it rained for the first 2 weeks, it was beautiful weather.
3 weeks.
And just idyllic places and a wonderful summer trip. So we have answer questions, and I'm just going to run some photos in the background as we answer questions. But
If you have any questions, we're happy to answer. Yeah.
You told me once that you haven't spoken about it. Now you have Starlink communications with you.
Yeah, so Deb does some consulting, and she was a little bit worried about having internet connection. We thought originally, oh, well, we'll pull into a town, a marina, and maybe we could get some Wi-Fi there. But we got as far as Pender Harbor, and we met this other boat, and they said, oh, well, we have Starlink. And so Deb ordered, and we talked to them about that. Deb ordered Starlink while we were in Pender Harbor and had it delivered to Prince Rupert, a marina that we just called out of the, we looked up and we said, oh, would you accept a package for us? They said, sure. So we had it delivered there. We arrived in Prince Rupert and got the package, took it down to the boat, unpacked it, plugged it in, and boom. So when we were in Haida Gwaii, we had no cell phone at all, no Wi-Fi. There was Wi-Fi within 100 miles, and we had full bandwidth internet. And that's where we got a lot of
150 megabytes.
Yeah, and she would do Zoom calls in the middle of nowhere with for her work, and it's
To a
actually
client in downtown Toronto. So I'd be like, no, I'm just swinging on the anchor if I lose you for a couple of seconds. But
it's
usually very stable, actually.
very, very reliable, and that's how actually we got a lot of our weather information.
Yeah.
Where's your power on?
What's that?
Do you require much power?
We did have to. It did suck some power, not as much as refrigeration. It did suck
Less than 5 amp hours less than 5 amps an hour. I'd say if you're moving and the satellite has to reposition a lot, that's what really uses most of the power. But once you're set, and if the satellite doesn't have to turn on its motors, then it's very little power, less than an amp.
Where did you mount the antenna?
We mounted it on a piece of PVC pipe just on the back of the stern, just got it up above our bimini, and it worked out really well. They give you about 200 feet of cable, so it's designed to be mounted outdoor, so you can pretty much anywhere you can get it on your boat and get a clear view of the sky. You should have no problem.
It's a subscription service, isn't it?
You buy the equipment and then you pay by the month for the,
Turn it on and off, like right now. You
turn it on and off. It's off now, yeah. So for that, it's for RVs or for mobile users. So it really, I mean, it's not cheap, but it's nothing like other satellite services, and it's really, yeah, it really worked out well for us. And we actually, the folks we traveled with had a family member with issues, but we were able to keep in touch with their healthcare provider all the way down and down the coast. So that was actually is nice, but helping them complete their trip without worrying about their sister-in-law was really nice. Yeah. On the beach, I don't think we saw a bear.
We never saw a bear, but we saw bear
We
tracks
saw bear tracks. That's
below
right.
high tide.
But we saw mink, we saw otters, we saw
Whales.
whales.
Yeah, lots of deer, which are
Deer.
not welcome in
Indigenous.
Haida Gwaii, but anyways, there they are. And porpoises, lots of sea lions. Yeah, but not. Yeah, I was surprised that we did. Well, we're not early risers, and bears are. So I think that's part of it.
You gotta get permission to stop at the various places in Haida Gwaii.
You have to, so stopping at the historical spots, where,
In the park, you have to get
permit, well, you have to have a permit for the park, which they never asked us for.
We're
And
not
when
charged
you,
for that.
so if it's an area where there's no historical site, you can just drop your anchor and go on land. But if you want to go see an old village, a historical site, then generally what you did was you just motored up, you dropped the anchor, and then you call them on a radio frequency and say, we're here, can we come on land? And then they would meet you at the beach and they would walk you through. And that's so people don't just, they're not people there who would not care for the historical legacy of the area. And then they walk you back to the beach, you get on, you go back to your boat.
It's very informal.
Yeah, it's very informal, very informal. But yeah, very well protected by the watch keepers. That's their job. Because it used to be that people in power boats, half a century ago would drive up, take a chainsaw and cut off a totem literally and bring it back home, put it on their boat and bring it back home. So they're basically protecting those sites from any kind of vandal.
And even if you're not going to take your boat, consider either driving up and taking the ferry over or flying in, because it's really remarkable. It's kind of unique in the world spot.
And
Or if you're a kayak trip, you're really hardy,
If you're,
which is really suffering in my opinion.
Yeah.
compared to what we had on our
we
boat.
didn't want to suffer that.
the whole central coast is just this ocean wilderness, and there's hardly anybody there. There's a few tribes and villages, and there's hardly any boats. There are some big power boats that go up the inside passage up to Alaska, but it's just this beautiful wilderness that's pretty much untouched, really gorgeous place. And it's, if you're careful and you do your planning and you understand your boat and you have some seamanship skills,
Plan for your gateways.
yeah, it's not hard to get there. It takes some time, but great place to go.
What was like the biggest mileage?
We generally motored about 4 hours a day. We weren't pushing real hard. We did a couple of 10-hour days. We'd go between 4 and 6 hours a day. We were not, like
60 miles.
I think we did 1 or 2 17 nautical miles in a day, so those were very long days.
yeah, those.
And the weather was so crummy, we thought, well, why pull in and drop the anchor and sit there in the rain? So we just kept going. The days grew long.
Yeah, and our boat does, 5 knots, 5.5 knots, not a real fast boat. So.
Did you use solar panels to recharge your?
We don't have
batteries?
solar.
It's high on our list now.
Oh.
Hey, and we found our boat, because of our weak batteries, if we spent more than 2 days, we started having low battery problems. Solar would have helped that, but our batteries were kind of old lead acid batteries that really should be, we're talking about replacing them. And, because we were running most days, it wasn't even an issue. It's only when we were in one place for 3 or 4 days that it was a problem. But if you have more modern batteries than we have, you wouldn't have that problem so much, and a little bit of solar. So, anything else?
Well,
We